February 18th, 1944, and the wind on Attu Island, Alaska screamed like something alive and hungry. Corporal James William crouched low at the entrance of what used to be a Japanese bunker, now half collapsed and buried in snow, his flashlight cutting a thin beam through the darkness ahead. What he saw next would change everything. Eyes, dozens of them, staring back from the shadows. But these weren't the eyes of soldiers ready to die fighting. These were the eyes of women, 15 of them, barely clinging to life in a tomb they never thought they'd escape. William lowered his rifle slowly, his breath coming out in clouds of frozen mist. Behind him, the temperature was already dropping fast, and a blizzard was building on the horizon like a wall of white death. They had maybe 2 hours before visibility dropped to zero, 2 hours before anyone caught outside in that storm would freeze solid where they stood. The women huddled together in torn blankets and ragged army coats that hung off their skeletal frames. One of them stepped forward from the group, an older woman with gray-streaked black hair, and even in her condition, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. She wore the shredded remains of a nurse's uniform under a Japanese army coat several sizes too large. She bowed with precise, formal grace, and then she spoke in broken English that trembled with exhaustion and desperate hope. "We are nurses," she said. "Please, mercy." That single word hung in the frozen air between them like a prayer. Mercy. If you're moved by these forgotten stories of courage and humanity in the darkest hours of war, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because these moments deserve to be remembered. They remind us what humanity looks like when everything else has been stripped away. In that moment, William realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. These women had been left here to die, and not by the Americans, but by their own side, abandoned and forgotten in one of the most hostile places on Earth. Attu was the edge of the world, the westernmost island in Alaska's Aleutian chain, a place where the wind never stopped howling and fog swallowed men whole, where temperatures could drop 30 degrees in an hour and the cold killed as efficiently as any bullet ever made. The Japanese had seized the island in June 1942 as part of their northern offensive, claiming a strategic foothold on American territory. By May 1943, the United States had launched Operation Land Crab to take it back, and what followed was one of the bloodiest battles in the entire Pacific theater. Nearly 550 Americans were killed in action, and over 2,300 were wounded. Of the 2,900 Japanese defenders, only 28 were taken alive. The rest died fighting or killed themselves rather than face the shame of surrender. What almost no one knew was that among those Japanese forces were 15 women, nurses from the Imperial Japanese Army Nurse Corps, who had volunteered for this assignment, one of the most dangerous in the entire war. They were there to tend to wounded soldiers in the most remote and hostile environment imaginable, working in underground bunkers that offered almost no protection from the brutal elements outside. They treated frostbite and gangrene and wounds that got infected from the constant dampness. They survived on rice rations that dwindled with each passing week, melted snow for water, and burned scraps of paper just to generate a little warmth. When the American assault finally came, Japanese command made a decision that sealed thousands of fates. Rather than surrender, they ordered a final banzai charge, a suicidal attack meant to take as many Americans as possible. The nurses were told to remain behind in the bunkers to tend to the dying, and when the Americans came, they were expected to take their own lives. It was considered honorable. But the battle ended in chaos with communication, lines cut and officers killed in the fighting. And in all that confusion, the 15 women found themselves trapped in a bunker that had been overlooked during the American sweep of the island. For 9 long months, they survived on scraps and fading hope that rescue would come. It never did. Their own military had forgotten them, or perhaps just assumed they were already dead. The bunker became their tomb, or so they thought, until that day in February when everything changed. By early 1944, Attu was considered secure, and the 7th Infantry Division had moved on to fight other battles. What remained on the island was a skeleton crew assigned to weather station duty and cleanup operations, cataloging the frozen remnants of a battle that felt like ancient history. Corporal James William from Ohio was part of a 4-man team sent to clear out Japanese bunkers for demolition. William was 24 years old, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher, and before the war he had planned to study engineering at Ohio State University. Now he spent his days picking through the remnants of battles fought by men who were long dead. The first 2 bunkers his team checked held exactly what they expected to find: frozen corpses and rusted rifles and spoiled rations covered in frost. But the 3rd bunker was different. Steam, thin wisps of it rising from cracks in the entrance, visible even in the cold air. William raised his hand, and the patrol stopped moving. Steam meant heat, and heat meant life. His finger moved to the trigger of his rifle because they had been warned about holdouts, Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender and would attack without warning, fighting to the death. He motioned to Private Chun to move left while he and Sergeant Davis moved right, and the 4th man, Private Kowalski, provided cover from behind a snow drift with his rifle ready. Chun was 32, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who spoke some Japanese because his family had fled Shanghai in 1937 when the war came there. He had personal reasons to hate the enemy. Sergeant Davis was from Alabama, a career soldier who had already seen action in North Africa and knew what real combat looked like. Kowalski was 20 years old, still green, still believing the world could be divided into clear lines between good and evil. William crouched at the entrance and clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness inside, and what he saw made him freeze in place. Eyes, dozens of them staring back at him, but not the eyes of soldiers ready to fight. These were eyes filled with terror and something else he didn't expect, hope that was desperate and fragile and about to break. "Don't shoot," William yelled to his team. He kept his rifle raised, but his finger stayed off the trigger. Behind him, he heard Chun moving into position and heard the click of Davis releasing his safety. Slowly, figures began to emerge from the darkness inside the bunker. Women, thin and hollow-cheeked, wrapped in ragged blankets and torn military coats that barely kept them warm. They moved like ghosts, their faces blank with exhaustion that went deeper than anything physical. William had seen plenty of horrors in this war, but the sight of these women barely clinging to life hit him harder than any combat he'd experienced. One woman stepped forward from the group. She was older than the others, maybe in her 30s, with gray-streaked black hair. She wore the remains of a nurse's uniform beneath a Japanese army coat that was several sizes too large for her thin frame. Despite her condition, despite the months of starvation and cold, she carried herself with an unmistakable dignity. She bowed in the formal Japanese way, and then she spoke in halting English that was careful and measured. "We are nurses," she said. "Please, mercy." The word mercy hung in the frozen air like something sacred. William lowered his rifle completely. Behind him, Sergeant Davis let out a low whistle and muttered, "Jesus Christ, they've been here the whole time." William counted them quickly. 15 women, all in similar condition, malnourished and suffering from frostbite, and some were so weak they could barely stand on their own. One woman sat slumped against the bunker wall with her eyes closed and her breathing shallow and irregular. Another had bandages wrapped around both hands, the cloth black with old dried blood. Chun reached for the radio clipped to his belt. Static, nothing but static. The radio was dead. Maybe the cold had killed the batteries, or maybe the mountains were blocking the signal. Either way, they were on their own, with no way to call for help. William looked outside at the sky. It was darkening fast, and the wind was changing direction, picking up speed. He could feel it in his bones. The barometer had been falling all morning, and anyone with experience on Attu could read the signs. They had maybe 2 hours before the storm hit in full force, and when it did, anyone caught outside would die. He made a decision right there. "We take them back to base now," he said. Kowalski's eyes widened in disbelief. "Sarge, base is 8 miles through this," he said, gesturing at the darkening sky and the wind picking up. "These women can't walk 8 miles in their condition." William knew he was right. 8 miles in good weather was a long hike across rough terrain. In a blizzard, it would be a death march. But the alternative was leaving them here in this bunker, and that was not an option he was willing to consider for even a second. Davis stepped closer and lowered his voice so only William could hear. "William, think about this," he said. "We've got 4 men, 15 prisoners, and a blizzard coming in fast. The odds are bad, really bad. We might not make it back, and if we don't, that's 4 American soldiers dead trying to save the enemy." William met his gaze without flinching. "They're not the enemy," he said. "Not anymore. Look at them. They're just people who need help. And if we leave them here to die, we're no better than the bastards who forgot about them in the first place." Davis held his gaze for a long moment, reading the determination in William's eyes, and then he nodded slowly. "All right then," he said. "Let's do it." The nurses understood enough to know they were being rescued, though the word rescue felt strange and impossible to them. They had been taught that Americans would torture them, defile them, parade them as trophies of war. Yet here were these soldiers looking at them not with hatred or cruelty, but with something that looked almost like pity. The oldest nurse, whose name was Yuki, tried to organize the others despite her own exhaustion. She spoke in rapid Japanese, her voice firm and commanding. Slowly the women gathered what few possessions they had left, a medical bag with almost nothing in it, a torn blanket, a single photograph of someone they loved. Yuki had been a nurse for 12 years before the war started. She had trained in Tokyo at one of the finest hospitals in all of Japan. She had delivered babies and set broken bones and held the hands of dying patients in their final moments. But nothing in all her training had prepared her for Attu. She had watched women under her care die from starvation, from cold, from diseases that should have been easily treatable. She had held them as they cried for their mothers, as they whispered prayers to gods who seemed to have abandoned this frozen island completely. And through it all she had maintained discipline, kept the nurses working and focused, kept them from falling into total despair. But now, facing these American soldiers, she felt her iron control beginning to slip. This was the moment she had both feared and hoped for in equal measure. Rescue meant survival, but it also meant surrender, and surrender meant shame in the eyes of her culture. In her mind, she could hear her father's voice from childhood, death before dishonor. But looking at the young women under her care, some of them barely 18 years old, she made a choice. Life, whatever the cost to her honor. William and his men did what they could to help. They shared their rations, hard biscuits that tasted like cardboard and chocolate bars that were so frozen they had to be broken apart with rifle butts. They offered water from their canteens, though it was already starting to freeze solid. The women ate slowly, carefully, as if the food might disappear if they rushed. Some of them cried as they ate, tears running down their hollow cheeks and freezing before they hit the ground. Yuki insisted that everything be shared equally among all 15 women. Not a single crumb was wasted. As they prepared to leave the bunker, William realized the true scope of the problem facing them. 3 of the women could not walk at all because their feet were black with advanced frostbite, swollen and useless. 5 more could barely shuffle forward, each step causing them visible agony. Only 7 had enough strength left to attempt the journey on foot. "We'll have to carry them," Davis said quietly. It was not a question, it was simply a statement of fact. They fashioned crude stretchers from tent canvas and broken rifles, working quickly because time was running out. William distributed the weight as evenly as possible among his small team. He and Davis would carry one stretcher, Chun and Kowalski would carry another, and the walking wounded would follow behind them, roped together for safety so no one could get lost in the storm. Yuki would lead that group. Before they left, William took out his compass and checked their bearing carefully. Base was northwest, 8 miles across extremely rough terrain. In good weather, they could make it in about 3 hours. In a blizzard, if they made it at all, it would take 5 or 6 hours minimum. He looked up at the sky one more time. The clouds were darker now and much lower, moving fast across the sky. Snow had started to fall, light flakes that danced and swirled in the wind. Soon those light flakes would become a solid wall of white. They needed to move right now. The blizzard hit them hard just 20 minutes into their journey. One moment visibility was perhaps 50 yards, and they could see the terrain ahead. The next moment it was nothing, absolutely nothing. The world became white and howling and completely disorienting. Snow blew horizontal instead of falling, stinging any exposed skin like thousands of needles. The temperature plummeted so fast it felt unreal. William felt his face going numb within minutes. He felt ice forming in his eyebrows and mustache, turning his facial hair white. His hands, even protected by thick gloves, began to lose all feeling. This was how people died on Attu, not from enemy bullets, but from cold that crept in slowly and stole life 1 degree at a time. William had tied a rope to each person in the group, creating a human chain that connected them all. Without that rope, they would have been separated and lost within minutes in the whiteout. Even with the rope, he could barely see the person directly in front of him. The wind was so loud it drowned out every other sound, making communication almost impossible. He carried the first woman on his back. She was small, perhaps 90 pounds at most, but in this cold and with this wind pushing against him, she felt like she weighed twice that much. Her arms wrapped weakly around his neck, and he could feel her shivering violently against him, her breath shallow and rapid against his ear. Every single step forward was a battle against the elements. The snow was knee-deep in many places, and even deeper in the drifts that had formed. His legs burned with exhaustion, and his lungs screamed for air. The thin atmosphere of Attu made every breath feel insufficient, like he wasn't getting enough oxygen. But he kept moving forward anyway. One step, then another, refusing to stop. Behind him, Davis carried another woman on his back. This one had lost consciousness, her head lolling against his shoulder and her arms hanging limp at her sides. Davis had served in North Africa before this and had marched through the Sahara Desert in heat that literally killed men where they stood. He had thought that was the worst environment imaginable for a soldier. He had been completely wrong. Chun and Kowalski took turns carrying the third woman, switching off every 10 minutes to preserve their strength. Chun's face was a mask of determination, but his eyes betrayed his fear because he knew the odds they were facing. 4 men, 15 women, 8 miles to travel, temperatures 20 below zero with wind chill and zero visibility. This was suicide by any reasonable calculation. But he also knew that if they turned back now, those women would die in that bunker. And despite everything, despite the war and despite what the Japanese military had done to his family back in China, he could not abandon them to that fate. The other nurses followed as best they could, those who were able to walk supporting those who could barely move. Yuki was everywhere at once, moving up and down the line constantly, speaking softly in Japanese, encouraging them, demanding they keep moving, absolutely refusing to let anyone give up. She pushed when they needed pushing, held them when they needed holding, and always kept them moving forward no matter what. The first hour of the march was pure hell. The wind cut through their clothes like knives made of ice. The snow found every gap and every opening in their clothing, worked its way inside until they were soaking wet and freezing. William's feet went numb first, then his hands lost all sensation, then his face became completely frozen. He could no longer feel the woman on his back except as dead weight pressing down on him. He could not tell if she was still shivering or if the shivering had stopped, and he knew that stopping meant she was dying. He wanted desperately to check on her, but could not spare the energy or the time. He could not stop moving even for a single second. The second hour was somehow even worse than the first. William lost all sense of direction in the complete whiteout. The compass was useless in the blizzard conditions. He navigated purely by instinct and memory, trying to remember landmarks that were now buried under feet of snow. At one point, he was absolutely certain they were lost and heading in the wrong direction. Then Chun shouted something barely audible over the wind. He had found something, a ravine that offered at least some break from the relentless wind. It was not much shelter, but it was enough for a brief rest. They huddled together there, packed as tightly as possible for shared warmth. The soldiers formed an outer ring with their bodies, blocking the worst of the wind from hitting the women directly. No one spoke because speech required energy they simply did not have to spare. They just breathed in and out, watching their breath crystallize instantly in the frigid air, trying desperately to preserve what little body heat remained, trying to stay alive just a few minutes longer. After 20 minutes, they had to force themselves to move again. Staying still any longer meant freezing to death where they sat. The cold was insidious and deceptive. It made you want to sleep, made rest seem like the answer to everything. But rest in these conditions was death. William hoisted the woman back onto his back with muscles that screamed in protest. Her violent shivering had stopped completely. That was a very bad sign. When the shivering stopped, it meant hypothermia was setting in deep. The body was conserving its last energy for vital organs, shutting down everything else to survive. He needed to move faster, but moving faster was physically impossible. Kowalski suddenly fell, just collapsed into the snow like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Chun grabbed him immediately and hauled him back to his feet with strength that surprised both of them. "I can't," Kowalski gasped through blue lips. "I can't do this anymore. I'm done." His face was chalk white, and his lips were turning blue. William turned around in the blizzard. Through the swirling snow, he could barely make out the younger soldier's face. "Yes, you can," William said, not encouraging or sympathetic, just stating a simple fact. "You will keep moving because if you don't, you die right here, and so does everyone who's tied to you on this rope." It was harsh and brutal, but it worked. Something flared in Kowalski's eyes, maybe anger or shame or just raw animal survival instinct. And he got back up, grabbed the rope with frozen hands, and started moving forward again. When one of the nurses simply sat down in the snow and refused to move, Yuki knelt beside her and spoke urgently in Japanese. Then she slapped the woman hard enough to shock her back to awareness. She hauled the woman to her feet by sheer force of will and kept the column moving forward, relentless in a way that absolutely stunned William. She was just as exhausted as any of them, maybe more so, but she refused to let anyone quit. "We survived 9 months together," she told him in rough, broken English. No one gets left behind now. He could only nod in agreement, because speaking was too difficult. The blizzard somehow worsened even more. The wind howled like a living creature trying to tear them apart. Time dissolved completely into endless white misery. William started seeing phantom lights in the storm and hearing voices that weren't there. He forced himself back to reality with a simple mantra repeated over and over. My name is James William, and I will not die here on this island. The woman on his back whispered something in Japanese, either a prayer or a farewell. He could not tell which. Another nurse collapsed without any warning, going completely unconscious but still faintly breathing. Kowalski said the brutal truth that everyone was thinking. We leave her here, or we all die. But when William met Yuki's eyes through the storm, he knew what the answer had to be. We carry her, he said simply. And so they did, rotating the burden every 10 minutes, each shift pure agony, moving forward only because stopping meant certain death for all of them. When the storm finally began to ease hours later, the supply depot appeared through the white like a miracle. Private Thompson on guard duty nearly shot them before realizing they were actually human beings and not ghosts. Medics rushed out into the snow immediately. The nurse on William's back opened her eyes for the first time in hours and whispered something in Japanese he could not understand but felt deeply in his soul. Yuki checked on the unconscious girl they had carried and then smiled for the first time. She lives, Yuki said. You saved her life. Even the experienced medics were stunned that Yuki was still standing upright after everything. Death is easy, she told them quietly. Living is what's truly hard. Years later, long after the war ended, Yuki appeared at William's door in Ohio to thank him properly for what he had done. When she finally died many years after that, William traveled all the way to Japan to place a single origami crane beside her grave.